watching BTV.
700 million people around the world are afflicted with mental health disorders that include depression, PTSD, and addiction. The direct and indirect costs are $2.5 trillion a year. And many of the existing pharmaceutical treatments either don't work that well or not at all. Cybin thinks the time has come for a different approach.
The primary focus of Cybin is to take classical psychedelic molecules and transform them into useful therapeutic agents for mental health disorders. We've been for too long trying to treat just the signs and symptoms of these diseases, and now we have an ability to really address the underlying causes of depression and anxiety and addiction.
I think it's clear that there's a very close relationship between hallucinogenic states and dreaming. I think psychedelics, and Matt knows way more about this than I do, of course, but psychedelics have some very interesting properties. They are certainly not for everybody, right? And kids, it's a problem, I think the major issues right now around the psychedelic conversation is that it's clear that they can unveil certain elements of neuroplasticity. They make the brain amenable to change, changing up space-time relationships, changing up the emotional load of an event and being able to reframe that. It's clear that happens. But there's two major issues. One is that people talk about plasticity as if plasticity is the goal. But plasticity is a state within which you can direct neurology. And the question is, what changes are you trying to get to? So people are just taking psychedelics to unveil plasticity without thinking about what circuits they want to modify and how. I think that's a problem. I think there's great potential, however, for people opening up these states of plasticity with psychedelics or otherwise and directing the plastic changes toward a particular endpoint. And there's an absolutely spectacular paper out of UC Davis, published as a full article in Nature just a couple months ago, showing that there are psychedelics that are now can be modified. So chemists have gotten into the game now and modifying to take away the hallucinogenic component where you still get the neuroplasticity components.
Wow.
And for a lot of people, it'll be like, oh, well, that's no fun. That's not giving you the wild experience. But I do think that that holds great potential for people that wouldn't otherwise orient towards some of these drugs. So I think it's really marvelous what's happening and what's about to happen. And I think there is one drug in that kit of drugs that's very unusual, like psilocybin, LSD. Those promote heavy serotonin release and lateralized connections ramp up, etc. Matt talked about all that. But MDMA, ecstasy, is a very unusual situation where dopamine is very, very high because of the way the drug is designed. Dopamine release, it goes through the roof. So people feel great and they want to move and they have a lot of energy. But serotonin levels are also high. And that's a very unnatural state. And why MDMA may, and I want to highlight may, have particularly high potential for the treatment of certain forms of depression is an interesting question, because never before as far as we know, in human history, has there been a possibility of opening up dopaminergic and serotonergic states at the same time. Dopamine being the molecule of pursuit and reward and more, and serotonin being one of bliss and being content right where you're at. So it's almost like those two things wrap back on themselves and create this very unusual state. And I think the bigger conversation is what to do with a state like that. Like, is it about self-love? Is it about developing love for another person? Is it about forgetting hate? Like, these are powerful molecules, and I think if the academic community and the clinical community is going to move forward with them in any serious way, I think there needs to be a conversation about what they're being used for.
There are really two very important differences between a psychedelic and a classical pharmaceutical, like, say, Prozac. One is that they work much more quickly. The first dose and you're seeing a response. And the other thing which is really, really important is that you don't have to give them every day to get a treatment response. Also, they work in treating patients that don't respond to the other drugs. This is what they call the therapy-resistant group. Those are the big breakthroughs.
The Kernel team's done a phenomenal job. They've taken this neuroimaging technology, which typically would take up a whole room and cost millions of dollars, and turned it into something portable. So we can look inside the brain and see what's happening before, during, and after a treatment. So that gives us the ability to collect a lot more data that's quantitative and not just qualitative depression scales or other scales that are sometimes used in psychiatry. The acquisition of Adelia Therapeutics brought us tremendous experience in medicinal chemistry and a phenomenal team that has a long history of developing not only pharmaceuticals but also developing psychedelics.
Cybin has already filed 10 patent applications. As a disruptor, Cybin knows they're being watched with great interest. The stakes are very high.
Big Pharma is paying attention already. The biopharmaceutical industry will demonstrate that these products are such important additions to our therapeutic toolbox that I would predict within 5 years we're going to see psychedelic drugs approved for treating a number of serious mental illness problems. So by definition, the pharmaceutical industry will become interested. This is a paradigm shift. Yeah, this is really a paradigm shift.
Like one of the projects that we haven't talked about is that I worked on it this morning and I have to work on it later today, is a psychedelic peacemaking.
Yeah.
So we have a project, Natalie Ginsburg, Lior Roseman, it's in Israel, and it's psychedelics for peacemaking between Israelis and Palestinians. Mm-hmm. And they've just come back from Israel a few days ago. And there's groups of Israeli Jews, Israeli Arabs, and Palestinians that are doing ayahuasca together.
Wow.
Kind of secretly, you know, or very secretly, but it's happening. And many of them have used MDMA.
Yeah.
Now, they're coming to these...
That's great.
It's incredible.
Because they're coming together.
They're coming together primarily for healing.